Hello, Chipmunk and Chipette fans. My name is Grandy Tamias, the speculative evolved species of upright walking chipmunk, and welcome back to another retrospective video. This time I'll be covering the 1999 direct-to-video film Alvin and the Chipmunks Meet Frankenstein, produced by Bagdasarian Productions and released by Universal Studios. Now, this isn't necessarily an anniversary retrospective, even though this movie has now turned 22 this year, which, incidentally, is my age. That said, I didn't actually discover this film until the early 2010s, maybe 2012 or 2013, and even then I was not yet compelled to study the in-depth history of the Alvin and the Chipmunks franchise or join the fanbase online. I just found this movie on Netflix and watched it out of curiosity, after having already seen Alvin and the Chipmunks Meet the Wolfman a few years prior. At first I considered this to be better than Wolfman, and that was probably due to the villain Dr. Frankenstein being a more active villain, seeking out the Chipmunks and his monster to enact his plans. But more on that later. With this being the second Alvin and the Chipmunks movie ever, there was a pretty high bar set by the Chipmunk adventure. Meet Frankenstein doesn't quite reach that level for me looking back on it now, and there are a few moments that feel unnecessary and drag on for a little longer than they should. That said, I still do enjoy this film, and it was a great return to the 80s style Chipmunks after the end of the series in 1990. And yes, there were a few holiday specials throughout the 90s, but those didn't really do much to keep the franchise in the public eye, and it was only after Bagdasarian partnered with Universal Studios in 1996 that efforts were made to bring the Chipmunks back in a bigger way. Although it was pretty slow given all the behind-the-scenes drama with Universal and Bagdasarian, so it didn't take until 3 years later for the film to have been made and released. Getting more into the fundamentals of the film itself, Alvin, Simon, and Theodore do now sport slightly tweaked designs than how they appeared in the cartoon and specials. Simon has reverted back to having black-framed glasses like in Season 1 and The Alvin Show. All three of them have eyes without colored irises, and Theodore's shoes are now orange. Prior to this, such as in the cartoon and the Chipmunk Adventure, Theodore's shoes were often depicted with light blue, much like Alvin's, while Simon's were red. Personally, I think the orange shoes fit Theodore better because not only does it make their shoes unique for all three of them, I think it also contrasts better against the green of his outfit. Their eyes would return to having colored irises in Meet the Wolfman, but aside from that, the Chipmunk character designs in both of these films are identical. Honestly, with the improved animation quality, these might just be the best that the 80s Chipmunks have ever looked. The only thing that would have made it better for me would be if Simon had gotten his blue glasses back in Meet the Wolfman. One last factoid I want to cover before I get into the plot. This film takes the longest amount of time before any of the Chipmunks are shown on screen, with them not appearing until 6 minutes in. It's a pretty interesting approach, I must say. I didn't expect them to start with a flashback set in a very old time period. Nowadays, I'd expect Bagdasarian to open on something the Chipmunks are already doing, and then when we actually need exposition for context, they incorporate it into the Chipmunks finding out. If Meet the Wolfman did this, they probably could have fleshed out Talbot's backstory, which would have helped that film in my opinion. But this kind of thing is a double-edged sword, because in those 6 minutes, the film also tries to establish more non-Chipmunk stuff like Mr. Yes-Man and this mother being upset that she and her child are not being scared by anything in the theme park. And this is what I was talking about with parts that drag on for too long. I think they should have had the Frankenstein flashback in the beginning, then use the spooky setting to crossfade into the similarly spooky concert with the Chipmunks and establish the theme park that way. The mother and child could be cut all together because they're annoying, and the stuff with Ted Yes-Man being concerned about the park could be established later when Dr. Frankenstein arrives. That's just how I would have handled the pacing of this film. Like I said, starting with a flashback before showing the Chipmunks in the present is a good concept in theory, but in the future, I'd rather see it used when it actually has something to do more directly with the Chipmunks themselves, like when they were younger, or maybe show other Chipmunks as they appeared in the past. That way, we still have something familiar to keep our attention that this is still a movie about talking chipmunks, and that it builds up to Alvin, Simon, and Theodore, appearing as we know them a few minutes later. Plus, it would be a good way to add more lore into the franchise, but I'm going off track, and many of y'all already know about my biased desire to see more chipmunks. Then again, is it really that biased? No one's really challenged me on that opinion yet. I don't know any fan who actively doesn't want to see more of their species. Okay, let's just drop that and get back to Meet Frankenstein. So after the stunning sequence that is the song Things Out There, Alvin wants to use the 1 hour they have before the next show to ride a dragon-themed roller coaster. But because he causes mischief by taking over a tram tour and driving it recklessly, they're kicked off and get lost on a studio backlot, causing them to miss their show and get locked inside after the park closes at night. They stumble upon a building with its lights still on, which is where Dr. Frankenstein is bringing his monster to life. Stopping at this moment for right now, I want to mention that like the Chipmunk Adventure before it and Meet the Wolfman after it, this movie's plot is partially inspired by a 19th century literary work. In this case, the original Frankenstein novel by Mary Shelley. However, this film draws most of its visual inspiration for this Frankenstein plot from various other film interpretations and how we know the story in pop culture today. In fact, the monster itself looks very similar to the 1931 film version played by Boris Karloff. That film was also released by Universal. In the novel, though, Frankenstein's monster is simply referred to as the creature. Victor Frankenstein is actually in his late teens, and there's no Igor assistant, which this film did leave out. Focusing on the Mad Doctor first, I like how he does actively try to go after the Chipmunks later for bearing witness to his experiment, unlike Mr. Talbot in Meet the Wolfman, who really only becomes a threat when the Chipmunks run into him or trespass on his property. However, Talbot is a more nuanced character and is more of the misunderstood type, I guess like Frankie also is in this film. So over the course of that film, you really understand why he's been hiding and why he gets so aggressive. With Dr. Frankenstein, there's no real reason given as to why he wants to make a monster or what he plans to accomplish with it. He's more of a I do evil things because I evil kind of villain. So in the kind of short pantheon of Alvin and the Chipmunks villains, I would have to consider Dr. Frankenstein one of the weaker ones. He just doesn't interest me enough to want to take him seriously because we don't even know what his ultimate goal is or why he acts as if the Chipmunks pose any sort of opposition to his plan. And yes, he was ridiculed back in his time period, which makes me wonder how and why he's suddenly in the modern day, but we get no indication that he could even get in trouble with modern authorities for what he's doing. If anything, the worst thing he does happens near the end of the movie with what he does to Alvin, but we'll get to that eventually. While I'm still stopped at this scene, I might as well mention that I like the running gag of Alvin getting upset at people touching his cap. Moments like this are few and far between throughout the rest of the franchise, so it's nice that they tried to use it in this film to add to Alvin's character. So Dr. Frankenstein then unleashes his monster, which chases the Chipmunks throughout the park and into Dragonland. Meanwhile, in another plot point that drags on and goes essentially nowhere, Dave goes into the Majestic Movie Studios park to look for the Chipmunks, but instead finds Dr. Frankenstein. He attempts to get Dave to fall asleep so that he can harvest his organs, but fails and ends up knocking himself out with a tranq dart. And Dave just ends up going home thinking the boys may have gone back there. In Dragonland, the Chipmunks try escaping on a roller coaster, but the monster holds it back before the main drop. When it finally does, we get this funny moment where their faces are warped by the additional G-forces, causing them to appear like their 60s selves, and then like real chipmunks similar to how they were on the covers of many of their original records. The ride launches them out of the park, but Theodore loses his teddy bear in the escape. The Chipmunks arrive home later, and we get another musical number, If a Monster Came in My Room, which is a pretty catchy song, but all things considered, I feel like it makes more sense if you watch it in the movie instead of just listening to the song by itself. Like, there have been Chipmunk songs before where they have little stories going on in the background, but without the visuals to back it up, you wouldn't understand in the song why Alvin at one point imitates the Terminator, which, granted, was sort of nonsensical in the movie too. They just made that reference for the heck of it. Point is, I like this song, but it doesn't really stand on its own from the movie like Things Out There, where I could play it at a Halloween party and everyone could understand it just fine. That night, Frankenstein's monster finds the Seville house, somehow, to give Theodore back his teddy bear. For his kindness, Theodore offers the monster a place to sleep for the night, and the next morning, Alvin nearly beats him with a baseball bat. But Theo quickly convinces them that the monster is good. He also gives him the new name, Frankie, so that's what I'm going to be calling him throughout the rest of the review. We get a brief cameo from Miss Miller and a classic chipmunk hijink moment where the boys make it seem like Frankie is just Dave in a costume. Soon after, the Chipmunks take Frankie to the playground, where he learns to open up and be kind to other people, over the course of the song, If You Want to Have Friends. Which definitely feels like it would belong in Little Alvin and the Minimonks, with it being a valuable life lesson to teach to kids. Later, the Chipmunks teach Frankie how to cook, but forgets to put on oven mitts when handling a hot tray of lasagna, causing him to throw it out the window. Alvin goes to retrieve it, but is kidnapped by Dr. Frankenstein, who also somehow found the Seville house. Seriously, does everyone know where the Chipmunks live? I guess it couldn't have been that hard for the doctor, since even Frankie figured it out. Simon and Theodore notice Alvin's cap left behind, and they, along with Frankie, go to rescue him at the theme park. In his evil lair, Dr. Frankenstein does something that actually would get him arrested for once, by forcing Alvin to drink a special potion that is not FDA approved, or a typical consumable beverage, and subjecting him to 50,000 volts of electricity. Simon, Theodore, and Frankie arrive to save Alvin, but after 3 minutes, the effects of the potion set in, and he turns into basically every Looney Tunes character rolled into one and goes about causing absolute chaos at a movie premiere. Simon finds an antidote for Alvin's transformation in Dr. Frankenstein's book, but it requires a lot of unusual ingredients. But Theo, being the food expert that he is, figures out that all of the things needed to make the antidote can be found at the buffet table, including frog legs, caviar, cow tongue, yes, people actually eat that, and escargot. Funny thing, I was working on my next Alvin and the Chipmunks elaboration about whether or not the Chipmunks are vegetarians, and I got as far as recording, but had to shelve that project because of college really getting in the way. But in my recording, I completely forgot to mention this moment in Meet Frankenstein. So I guess I'll have to go back and add that. Still, I cannot guarantee whether that will be out within the next few weeks. I might just end up doing a different elaboration that's easier to find images for, or maybe a shorter podcast-style one. Anyway, I find it funny how both of these Universal Chipmunk Meet Monster films have one of them eating meat, and that it actually affects the plot in some way. Dr. Frankenstein attempts to get into the premiere to intervene, but is stopped multiple times by a security guard. By the time he does make it in using a Sammy Squirrel costume he hates so much, Alvin and Theodore do manage to cure Alvin, and just in time for the concert that the Chipmunks are scheduled to perform at. Dr. Frankenstein makes one last attempt to electrocute Alvin to reinstate the transformation, but is stopped by Frankie, shocking him instead. The entire audience mobs up to attack Frankie, even grabbing torches and waving them at him, which Frankie has an adverse reaction to. This is consistent with most other depictions of Frankenstein's monster where he is weak to fire, including the novel. But Theodore steps in to defend Frankie by telling the mob that you can't judge a book by its cover, and so they start to realize that Frankie actually has a heart for others. The film ends with Frankie having gotten a job at the park as a tour driver, having been taught by the Chipmunks how to talk in a voice similar to theirs. But Alvin was the one who also taught him how to drive, so that goes about as well as you'd expect. Oh, and Dr. Frankenstein is trapped in his costume, forced to play Sammy Squirrel forever. And that's about it. Well, this was a pretty good Alvin and the Chipmunks movie. I like how the Chipmunks are portrayed personality-wise, especially Theodore. Despite all his fears, he still shows compassion towards Frankie and helps him open up to other people. The animation is great, and only improved going into Meet the Wolfman. The plot is a little weak, and the pacing is probably the worst part. For instance, it takes nearly 45 minutes into this 78-minute film for the Chipmunks to become friends with Frankie. So, more than half the movie is a bloated first act. The second act rushes through Frankie's development, but thankfully the third act is a lot more concise with the events leading up to, including and resolving Alvin's cartoon monster form. Considering how little Universal actually cared for the Alvin and the Chipmunks brand, I wonder if they had some mandate in place that if they were going to make a new film, they'd have to cross it over with one of their iconic monsters. As good as this Chipmunk Meeting Monsters duology is, I still question why these films exist in the first place and why they couldn't have just made a Chipmunk Adventure 2 or whatever, but maybe I'll make that an elaboration. These two films are perhaps the most famous out of the small handful of crossovers the Chipmunks have done, and I don't think there have been any others since. Again, I like this film, but aside from Frankie's character arc, adding monster lore into the Alvin and the Chipmunks universe just doesn't mesh well. Still, this is a pretty fun Halloween movie, and I like that it's not too scary for the younger kids, whereas Wolfman amped up the horror factor and may be another reason why that movie is more fondly remembered by the older fans. Feel free to let me know in the comments what you think of Alvin and the Chipmunks Meet Frankenstein, and how it has impacted you after all these years. I'd appreciate it if you could share and like this video, as well as subscribe if you haven't already and want to see more retrospectives like this. You can also follow me on Twitter and Discord, linked in the description. With all that said, I hope you enjoyed, have a happy Halloween, and thank you for your time.